Smoke covered the battlefield as shadows of soldiers moved through the fog of cannon fire, while a young French lieutenant stood trembling with orders clutched tightly in his hand behind him. Thousands of men awaited Napoleon's signal in front of him. The Austrian line loomed silent and deadly. The entire fate of the French Empire now rested on a single maneuver. The silence was broken by the thunderous call of drums, and with it began France's most ambitious bid for European domination. Years earlier, a Corsican artillery officer had emerged from the chaos of the French Revolution with fire in his heart and strategy in his mind. Napoleon Bonaparte rose through ranks not by birthright, but by brilliance. His victories in Italy were swift, ruthless, and brilliant as he pushed back Austrians with an army that believed in him more than in any king. France was in turmoil, the monarchy had fallen, heads had rolled in public squares, and the revolution had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. But what followed was hunger, civil unrest, and enemies on every border. The people needed stability, they needed a leader, and Napoleon became that beacon. By 1800, Napoleon declared himself first consul, then emperor. With each step, he seized power, not with tyranny, but with promise. He promised bread, he promised glory. He promised France its rightful place atop Europe. The coronation in Notre Dame was a declaration to the world. France would not bow, it would conquer. The Napoleonic Wars began in full when France turned its eyes eastward. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain formed coalitions to crush the rising star of France. Napoleon met them with strategy unlike any seen before. He moved his troops like chess pieces, striking where least expected. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 was his masterpiece. On a frozen plain in modern-day Czech Republic, the French army lured Austro-Russian forces into a trap, feigning weakness. Napoleon drew them in, then split their army with a devastating flank attack. Smoke and ice covered the fields as French soldiers overwhelmed the enemy. Within hours, an entire Allied force was broken. Europe shivered under Napoleon's gaze. Nation after nation fell under French control or influenced. The Confederation of the Rhine replaced the Holy Roman Empire. Spain was forced into submission. Italy was carved and reshaped. And even Prussia, once a proud military power, knelt in defeat. Yet Napoleon was not content with victory. He sought transformation. He introduced reforms wherever he went. Legal codes, educational systems, and infrastructure followed his conquests. He believed in reason and order and saw himself as the enlightened ruler Europe needed. But conquest breeds enemies, and the more land Napoleon took, the more the world united against him. Britain remained his most bitter foe, protected by its navy and wealth, unable to land a blow directly. Napoleon struck through economics. The continental system was his grand blockade, a plan to starve Britain by cutting off its trade. However, the system backfired. Smugglers found routes, economies suffered, allies grew restless. Portugal refused to comply, and Spain revolted. What began as a trade war turned into the brutal Peninsular War. French troops faced guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and an unrelenting British army led by Arthur Wellesley. Meanwhile, in the east, Russia loomed large. Napoleon grew distrustful of Tsar Alexander, who once had stood by him. And so began the most tragic chapter of the Napoleonic Wars, the invasion of Russia in 1812. More than 500,000 men marched from France across the vast steppes. The Grande Armée was the most powerful force in Europe. But Russia was not like the others. Cities burned, crops vanished, and the army was stretched thin. Moscow was taken, but it was empty and on fire. No surrender came. Winter fell with unforgiving cold, starvation, disease, and frostbite claimed soldiers faster than bullets did. What began as conquest turned into a nightmare of survival. By the time the Grande Armée retreated, only a fraction remained, frostbitten, starving, and broken. Europe saw that Napoleon was not invincible, and the dream of domination cracked under the weight of that winter. News of Napoleon. failure in Russia spread like wildfire across Europe, and the tides began to turn. Prussia, Austria, and Sweden joined Britain and Russia in the Sixth Coalition, sensing their moment to strike while the emperor was weakened. The Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, saw over 600,000 troops clash in the bloodiest confrontation in European history. At the time, Napoleon fought with the desperation of a man who knew his empire was crumbling. The Allies surrounded him, pressed from all sides, and after days of battle he was forced to retreat, crossing rivers under fire, losing thousands more with every step. The emperor returned to France weary and grim. His people still admired him, but exhaustion gripped the nation, and for the first time, doubt crept into the hearts of even his most loyal generals' cities, once adorned with banners, now whispered of defeat. In 1814, Paris fell. Foreign troops marched into the French capital, and with heavy heart, Napoleon abdicated. He was exiled to the island of Elba, allowed to live as a ruler of a tiny domain far from the world he once commanded. But the story did not end there. Less than a year later, news erupted across Europe. Napoleon had escaped Elba and returned to France. He marched toward Paris, gathering support with every step. Peasants, soldiers, and even officers abandoned the restored monarchy and rallied to him. The 100 Days began with thunderous energy. Napoleon stood once again as emperor, determined to reclaim his throne, not just in title, but in power. Europe responded with equal fury. Britain and Prussia mobilized to end his reign once and for all. In the fields near the village of Waterloo in Belgium, the final chapter unfolded. Rain soaked the ground as Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Blücher. Cannons fired, muskets roared, and horses thundered across muddy terrain. Victory seemed possible as French troops broke enemy lines, but Prussian reinforcements arrived, and the tide turned. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's most elite troops, charged in one last desperate attempt, but were driven back. Napoleon watched as the dream collapsed around him, his strategy once unmatched, now overwhelmed by numbers, time, and fate. He was captured, and this time exiled farther to St. Helena, an isolated island in the South Atlantic with no escape. He lived there for 6 years, writing, reflecting, and fading away from the world he once dominated. The Napoleonic Wars redrew the map of Europe, shaped modern warfare, and left deep scars in every nation they touched. Millions died, economies shattered, yet the legacy endured. Napoleon was not merely a conqueror. He was a reformer, a visionary, a man who rose from obscurity to challenge kings and emperors. He spread ideas of merit law and nationalism that would echo long after his fall. Though defeated, he reshaped the continent France had bid for domination, and though it ultimately failed, it changed the face of Europe forever, and the memory of that ambition lives on in every law code, every battlefield, and every story of a man who dared to rule the world.